Now we are the masters of our fate.
Back in 1940, Nazi Germany was winning the war by a landslide. They had just occupied France, Belgium, Norway, and it seemed like Britain was next. After all, the Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's air force, was bombing London every day and night, and the Royal Air Force was having trouble fighting them off. So much so that Britain's morale plummeted and people started to consider surrendering. But Winston Churchill, in all of his influence, delivered an inspirational speech to the entire nation. A speech that marked a pivotal point of the war and changed the course of history. Now, to the unsuspecting person, his speech and the impact it had on Britain's morale was nothing more than a stroke of luck. But if you get to know Churchill's life and work, you will realize that this moment was simply a culmination of everything he had done up until that point. Luckily for you, that's exactly what we are going to talk about in this video. So stay tuned, because you are about to discover everything about Winston Churchill, the man who ruled the British Empire. Born in 1874 in Blenheim Palace, Winston Churchill has always been a very unique and eccentric person. He was born into a typical British aristocratic family, with his father being a career politician and his mother a socialite. His parents barely gave him any attention, and so he was left to the care of his nurse, a lovely lady whom he was very close with. And despite coming from a very rich and noble family, Winston barely lived up to their standards, with bad grades and minor transgressions being extremely common. Fearing that he would fail any other type of career because of his bad grades and probable learning disability, his parents rushed him into a military career. Luckily, Winston Churchill excelled at the military, and he quickly rose through the ranks, having served as a lieutenant in important faraway British colonies, such as India and Sudan. And as we will be talking about shortly, this military experience served him well when things got tough for Britain during both world wars. During his service, he also worked as a part-time journalist, and it was there that he honed his public speaking and speechwriting skills, both of which would be very handy throughout his career. A few years later, after sensing that staying in the military would limit his influence on the future of the British Empire, he decided to get into politics. In his first years as a politician, he did not hold any meaningful positions in the government, but he has always been a noteworthy personality when it came to foreign affairs matters. For instance, unlike most people at the time, the First World War was not a surprise for him at all, and he had warned the British people years in advance that Germany's expansionism would drive Europe to a bloody war. He was also a very influential proponent of key progressive causes, such as women's suffrage and labor laws. And as his influence grew, he started rising through the ranks of the government, first becoming the Home Secretary, and then the First Lord of the Admiralty, that is, the political head of the Navy. Churchill held this title up until the start of the First World War, but after a string of bad decisions that cost Britain dozens of lives, his credibility came into question and he was demoted. The only problem was that Churchill simply could not stand watching the war on the sidelines. And in true Winston Churchill style, he enlisted in the army once again, but this time serving as a major. His bravery and leadership skills quickly gave him notoriety, and after the war ended, people started taking him seriously once again, thus allowing him to climb the government ranks. Winston Churchill, as usual, was a key public figure during the interwar period, that is, the period of relative peace between both world wars. For instance, he immediately opposed Hitler as soon as he stepped into power. On top of that, he was one of the few people that warned that Hitler's expansionism was dangerous for the entire world, and another war was on the horizon because of that. Unfortunately, his warnings fell on deaf ears. He even warned that Britain should increase its military spending in order to match that of Germany. But once again, nobody paid attention, and Britain was at a severe disadvantage when the war started. As fate would have it, Nazi Germany occupied a handful of nations just a few months into the war, and Britain was practically on its own to fight them off. And since Winston Churchill seemed to be the only sane voice in the government when it came to war matters, he was appointed as the Prime Minister. At the time, Churchill felt that his entire life was merely a preparation for that moment, and now he knew exactly what to do and had the courage to do it, unlike most other world leaders who were caught in the fog of war. The only problem was that Nazi Germany was undefeated and unstoppable up until that point. And it even seemed like defeat was imminent, since the Luftwaffe was bombing London practically every single day and Britain's morale started to plummet. However, all was not lost, and Winston Churchill gave an extraordinary speech that went down in history as the one that convinced the entire nation to fight against the Nazis and never think of surrendering ever again. In his own words, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Now, that speech marked a turning point for the entire war. Since up until then, the Allies were losing by a landslide, but after that, Britain managed to ward off the Luftwaffe from London and Nazi Germany finally started to retreat. What's more, besides leading Britain's response to the war, Churchill managed to get Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin on the same side and cooperate, and thus break Nazi Germany on both fronts. Churchill was also a key figure even after the war, having been closely involved in peace talks and advising governments at the start of the Cold War. Now, just like any politician, Churchill's career is also full of controversies. For instance, most people, even today, question his role in the human tragedy known as the Bengal famine. In case you don't know, the Bengal famine was a widespread food shortage that hit the southern Asian region of Bengal, a key British colony at the time. Back then, Japan had just occupied Burma, a key food supplier for South Asia. The only problem was that Britain adopted a scorched earth strategy. That is, they destroyed all of the key infrastructures in order to leave nothing behind that the Japanese army could use. This in turn disrupted food supply chains even more and affected dozens of millions of innocent people, with 3 million of them dying from famine. Winston Churchill was the then Prime Minister, but he did practically nothing to stop all of those innocent people from dying of hunger. To make matters worse, some people said that he didn't do anything because he disliked the Indian people. In fact, he even said at one point, in his words, "Indians are beastly people with a beastly religion." In his defense, some people say that it was the only sane decision he made, but the fact that he did not lift a finger to stop 3 million innocent people from dying is bizarre, to say the least. On top of that, Churchill has also been criticized for his personal beliefs on topics like racial prejudice and racial hierarchy. And in several interviews he gave back on his day, he said that the genocide of the American Indian people and the native people of Australia was totally justified, since now, in his words, a stronger and higher grade race now occupy the land. In his defense, some people say that the majority of the British people at the time held similar beliefs, and it would be unfair to judge him using the same moral principles we have today. Another one of his controversies was the fact that he used to receive hefty and generous gifts from big companies. Now, these gifts were framed as only that, gifts. But if we are being honest with one another, these gifts rarely have no strings attached to them, especially when coming from big corporations that only care about profiting. Luckily for him, there were no laws against gifts and donations from private corporations at the time. However, nobody knows for certain how much these gifts have impacted his views and policies. Unfortunately, Winston Churchill came to pass due to a stroke on a sad morning of 1965 at 90 years old. On the day of his death, people took to the streets in order to pay their tributes, and thousands of people gathered in front of his home to mourn his death and say their last goodbye. Even Queen Elizabeth II paid her tributes to him, having broken several royal protocols and attending his funeral alongside his family. And in her letter of condolences to Winston Churchill's wife, she said that the world was now poorer because of his sad loss. His funeral lasted for several days, with lots of military salutations and homages paid in his honor. Now, rumor has it that his death wasn't a surprise for those close to him. After all, he already had 8 strokes before the one that killed him. And on the day before his death, he told his family that he was already bored with it all. Now, even though Churchill has been gone for more than 5 decades, his legacy and work still live on. Especially his unique and impactful way with words, which allowed his speeches and public appearances to always be extremely remarkable. so much so that he could easily unite Britons to fight for a common cause and inspire them to take action, even when their own lives were at risk. And let's not forget about the crystal clear vision he had on foreign affairs, almost as if he was clairvoyant. And even today, many world leaders ask themselves the question, what would Churchill do when faced with a particularly difficult problem? And what is perhaps the most important legacy he left on this earth is that he literally shaped its borders. After all, if it weren't for him, Great Britain would have surrendered to the Nazis way back in 1940, thus changing the entire course of the war and the world we know of today. And just as he famously said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." Alright, and that was the story of Winston Churchill, the man who ruled the British Empire. As you can see, Winston Churchill has single-handedly shaped the course of the British Empire. And since he has been recently elected as the greatest Briton of all times, I think it is safe to say that history has indeed been kind to him. Now, I want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about Winston Churchill's story? Let me know in the comment section down below. And that's all for today's video. Thanks for watching, and until next time.